it's my pleasure to be speaking with Matthew Ehret, who is in Montreal, Canada. He's the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review, senior fellow at the American University in Moscow, Belt and Road Initiative expert on tactical talk, and has authored 3 volumes of the Untold History of Canada book series. In 2019, he co-founded the Montreal-based Rising Tide Foundation. So Matthew, it's great to talk to you.
It's great to be on.
So you've written a 3-part series on the American system of money and banking, which was the first of the series was picked up by Zero Hedge. You kindly cited me in the first paragraph. So, and I've gone into the American system a lot, but you've actually gone into it in more depth than I have. So that's what I'd love to talk about, how we can apply that today or get back to our original principles. We have so much civil unrest right now. We have such a divided country. And it seems to me that one thing that can or should unite us is our founding principles. We can go back to our history that we all share and we all feel this, same patriotic. We all agree about that, hopefully, about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and so forth, and about the economic system on which our country was based, which was, my understanding of the American system is basically it's government issued money and credit. So right now we have banker issued credit or money issued as credit by banks, and we have a central bank controlled system with the central banks all part of an international network that our Congress, they've actually declared their independence. Mm-hmm. So clearly we, the people, have very little control or leverage over that. But you in Canada have also, from 1937 to 1973 at least, had a very strong Bank of Canada, which was government owned and that was used to rebuild the country. So anyway, you've gone into this at length, and I'd love to hear your views on how we can get back to that original system and use it to solve these very serious crises, economic crises that we have right now.
Oh, yes. That's a really great opening. Thank you for that generous introduction. And also, thank you for writing that article, because honestly, in many ways, that is what spurred me on to produce my trilogy. The part 3 just went up today on Strategic Culture Foundation, and it'll be up on my website, CanadianPatriot.org, later on tonight. But indeed, a lot, it's demoralizing a little bit, because whether it's in Canada, it's more acute in the US, but it's also in Europe, all across the transatlantic, there's a lot of false, wasted time and false debate between these polarities, these dual extremes, that people think that if you're a liberal, I'm a sort of left-minded, I'm a more, moral type of thinker, then if I feel that way, I tend to have to adopt a Keynesian view of solutions when I'm in an economic crisis, a top-down view. So, printing money to sustain people, infrastructure, there's a lot of sympathy towards that stuff, but there's a view, okay, it's got to be top-down. Free markets have created enough problems. Privatizations have created enough problems for the past 5 decades. We don't need any more of that. There's too much unbounded freedom. I would say that there's a lot of truth in that, but there's some fallacies, some Trojan horses that are also embedded in that discussion. On the opposite extreme, there's a lot of patriots, a lot of very good people I've encountered, whether it's in Canada, the US, or Europe, who tend to be of a more conservative-minded bent, I should say, and are of the view, no, government has been the problem. Look at all of the disasters government has done, all of this incompetent spending, bailing out the banks that's obviously produced a hyperinflationary process that's going to blow out the economy. That doesn't work. And they'll find all of these abuses or malpractices of national governments. And their conclusion is no government. We need just bottom up. The solution is bottom up, not top down, bottom up. Get rid of all national top-down constraints. So, in both cases, I would say there are elements of truth, which is why both teams are attractive to be a part of, but both are also missing a fundamental principle of reality that has shaped much of recent history from the American Revolution, even before the American Revolution, as you get through in your article onward. And in your article, I just loved how you were able to just condensely in a very short space examine the origins and the evolution of the American system of political economy, which people try to, today, many people try to categorize it in some and fit it into some prefixed category that they're comfortable with. And it's neither top down nor is it bottom up. It uses principles of national planning, national banking, national regulation. That's true. Those things are used. Does that make it some radical socialist Marxist thing? No, it's not. It's not that at all. Because whenever it's been applied, and there's always been a fight, it's never been, we call it the American system, but it's never been fully operational for very long. And when it has worked, it's been sabotage. So when you look at it, you have to sort of be sensitive to that dynamic that there has been intentional sabotage from 1776, even before that, like I said, onward to the present day. Usually, if you want to see get an entry point into examining it, you could look at the presidents who tend to die while in office. There's been 8 of them. It's just the same. Just saying. Just look at what they're doing. Whether it's Harrison or whether it's Lincoln or whether it's McKinley or Garfield or Warren Harding or Roosevelt or JFK, just look at what they're doing. Look at their policies and look at who's opposing their policies and who they're opposing. What power structures are they threatening to move the power away from? And these are people from, as you heard these names, from both parties, right? Left, Democrat, Republican. It's something that's trans-political or trans-party, I should say. So there, under those periods, you have blossomings of free enterprise, of private capital. You have free markets even exist in different ways. So you have a blossoming of the idea of individual liberty being expressed in reality, while at the same time, paradoxically for some, you have national controls. Okay, so for some people, that their minds can't compute that because they've been so wired by whether it's Keynesian economic theorists or whether it's Austrian School libertarian theorists to try to define the past from these preset false categories. They can't understand what is it exactly that was being reactivated with John F. Kennedy or being reactivated earlier with Franklin Roosevelt under the New Deal and his battles with the bankers in London who wanted a world government controlled by central bankers in 1933 during the London Conference, or his Wall Street battles to break up the Wall Street banks with Glass-Steagall. What was that McKinley was trying to do with his programs of 1896, the Republican Party platform of a protective policy with an investment into manufacturing? What was that Lincoln was doing with his greenback policy and the infrastructure investments that were ultimately sabotaged that should have gone on to Reconstruction of the South? Or earlier with Hamilton, or his mentor Benjamin Franklin, or his mentors Cotton Mather, or any of the original leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony of the 17th century. It doesn't fit. You have to sort of shed the ideologies of top down or bottom up London School of Economics, because I mean, again, this whole thing really, this debate between Keynes versus Hayek, as I go through in my series, it really does emanate from the London School of Economics, Cambridge, Oxford trifecta in 1932 that artificially created this false debate, knowing that Franklin Roosevelt was likely going to be elected by November 1932. And it not only confused people back then, because I got to tell you, if you actually read my articles where I have citations at length from people like Keynes, like Roosevelt, like Francis Perkins, Roosevelt was not a Keynesian, okay? We're told he was. I am aware of that might be a controversial thing to say. But he thought and said on record that he thought Keynes was a mathematician and not an economist. Keynes thought that he was an economic incompetent. Frances Perkins writes this in her autobiography, her biography of Franklin Roosevelt. There's something more going on. And that's what I tried to get across in this trilogy, and that's, I think, what you were able to really get across, the soul of this American tradition that's been suppressed and scrubbed out of our history books and our economic textbooks. It's very hard to investigate this, but you were able to get across what this was, from Benjamin Franklin to Hamilton to John Jay, Henry Clay, Henry C. Carey, Matthew Carey, Lincoln, McKinley. Like there's been this continuity of battle, and it's not socialist again, and it's not free market, laissez-faire capitalism. It's something else. It's a different species of thinking. So, yeah, that's what I tried to do, and I think that you did that very well.
So I think today the closest model we have to the American system is the Chinese system, which, what we don't want to adopt their totalitarian. I mean, that's way too top down, but their economic system is the government issues the money and the government issues the credit. The government owns the banks, and therefore they can build, all sorts of, like 12,000 miles of high-speed rail in 10 years. How do they do it? They just issue the credit, build the thing, the fees pay back the loan. And that's more or less the model of HR 6422, the National Infrastructure Bill that I was writing about, which would be copying Roosevelt's Reconstruction Finance Corporation, basically. So all that is good. And I've actually read and thought what I would write about next is that the Chinese digital yuan, the central bank digital yuan, which they're 80% of central banks supposedly are going to be issuing their own digital currencies soon. And the Chinese are way ahead of us, and theirs is actually put in. They're already testing it. They've already got all the software for it, which we don't. So they're way ahead of us. But the thing is, now that they've got that, they can then just issue loans as much as there is a demand for all around the world. And of course, they already have a big network of countries that are borrowing from them because, unlike the IMF, which has loans with strings attached, they force you into austerity if you're going to borrow from the IMF. Yeah. The Chinese are, they're more favorable creditors. And now if they can just issue their money directly, easily through a digital currency, they could well take over the dollar as global reserve currency. I wrote, I don't want to make this an interview about me, but anyway, I wrote years ago that, because I quoted somebody who said that the Chinese got that system from Henry Carey in Lincoln's time when they had a close relationship with China. And I wrote that somewhere, and some Chinese person said, we had government issued money 1,000 years before you did, or I don't remember when, but they originally issued their own money long ago. So we can't really even claim authorship over this. But I know you've written about the Belt and Road and so forth, and that Canada should join the Belt and Road system. But how can we fix this globally? Because we've got a serious global issue besides our domestic issues. We could do it both ways, it seems to me, but the question is who controls it, and can we prevent? I know many people, experts that I like and that I don't want to offend, are quite sure that the plan here is to get us all hooked on this digital currency, and then they will turn it off if we don't comply with the rules. So it's a form of control, it's a form of enslavement.
Yeah.
Obviously don't want that, but the premise is good. So what do you think?
Well, I think that, this, what you've just said is just so, there's so many places you can go with it. But I think the thing that sprung to my mind is the question of value, because we're often using, I think everyone has an experience sometimes talking to somebody where you're both English speakers or whatever languages you're speaking in, and you're using a lot of the same words, but you discover very quickly that even though your words are the same, let's say you're talking about economics or banking, you're discovering that the ideas associated with the words are totally different. It's like this person lives in a different universe. Oftentimes people will mistakenly think that a debt is a debt is a debt, right? That a dollar invested in a person who digs random holes and fills them back up again is getting a paycheck, and that paycheck is going to pay for their food, which is going to stimulate a farmer, and that will stimulate the farmer's need to have electricity, and that will cause somehow, in a bottom-up way, government to invest in investing in electricity grids because there's enough farmers now that have demand, and the demand somehow causes the government to act, and somehow that's just how they've worked out the equation of how value works, or somebody who gets a debt to build something, they're told, well, that debt is equal whether you want to build a casino or a whorehouse. Might cost you $1 million versus a debt to build a dam or a rail manufacturing plant, let's say, or so they're told, well, mathematically speaking, a debt is a debt. It's the same $1 million. The banks can use it, can securitize that, whatever. They can use that as collateral equity, whatever that they want in their own practices. But the reality is that true? No. It's true if you're a mathematician and you don't look at qualities in the world. But if you're a human being, you know that there's the practices associated with the casino economy. Let's say all of America was induced to work like Vegas. Well, I guess it kind of is, but let's just say you just had all of the cities just adopt casinos and under a certain business model. Would that create a positive or negative net value for the society as a whole? Monetarily, you might get a lot of money, might be justifiable on that level for a short period of time. But who's producing the food? Who's maintaining your infrastructure? Right? Where's the education for the next generation of better engineers and scientists going to come from? No one's thinking about that. So the question is really a matter of quality, of value. And I think when you look at what China's doing and what they get a lot of it, there's a lot of attacks on China from a lot of the Western mainstream media rags who are trying to sort of do a little Freudian psychological projection by telling us that they're creating debt slavery in all of the countries who are stupid enough to get on board with the Belt and Road Initiative. For those who don't know, this is the Belt and Road Initiative, or New Silk Road. This is something which was announced in 2013. Today, there's almost 140 nations of the world who have signed on to the framework for this. It's a totally alternative banking model. There's different banks: Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, New Development Bank, Chinese Export-Import banks. Many state banks are involved. It's built around a certain type of paradigm of win-win cooperation, of the idea that we can get our self-interest more guaranteed as investors if we're investing in things that allow participant countries, whether it's in Africa or whether it's in Asia or the Middle East or Europe, to develop and stand on their own 2 feet, to have real infrastructure that might be a little bit more patient. You have to wait maybe 5 or 10 or 20 years for these types of investments to begin to start producing monetary profit. So patience is important, as it should be for any gardener. You have to wait till your garden starts producing some food. You can't just get it right away, the way some speculators on Wall Street would rather have it. But at the same time, it's of a more truthful order of value versus the IMF World Bank practices that we saw people like John Perkins, the Confessions of an Economic Hitman document, which is an intentional entrapment of countries from 1947 until really it goes on today, where any country who gets these IMF or World Bank loans is induced to take on conditionalities which are designed to have the effect of not only hyperbolically increasing their debts so they could pay them back, and yet still within 20 years have 20 times more to pay, as we've seen from almost every third world country. And also it deprives them of the ability to have indigenous manufacturing and local controls of their banking or finance. There's no ability for a nation to stand on its own 2 feet. And it's really the same argument that Benjamin Franklin had with the British East India Company and the British financiers of London back in the 1720s, when he was writing on the necessity for paper currency, calling for and arguing for the right of the young colonies to be able to have access and develop their own local manufacturing, so the agricultural and the industrial worker could coexist. It's a much more efficient, mode of organizing yourself, right? Rather than shipping your raw materials across the ocean, so that the British monopolies could then transform it into usable goods to then send back horseshoes or hats or clothes or whatever to the colonies. That's a lot of wasted effort if you think about the amount of energy that has to be expended in that long process of like taking your lumber or your iron raw material, put it on a ship, set it for months across the ocean, have the London manufacturers turn it into something useful and then send it all the way back slowly just to do something you could have done for yourself. It's like that today with every country. And China, just like Benjamin Franklin, is of the view that we have more reliable partners if we encourage Nigeria or Kenya or any Burma to start developing their own local infrastructure, their own manufacturing, and they're training new generations of engineers in Congo, in Sudan, to build the dams, to build the infrastructure. And it's not that these are practices that used to be more in harmony with America's self-conscious traditions under people like John F. Kennedy, who was working with Kwame Nkrumah to build the Volga Dam in Ghana, which was done entirely through John F. Kennedy's work on providing investment capital for Ghana to build this giant dam, which unfortunately through a coup d'etat in 1967, Kwame Nkrumah was ousted, and those higher development plans for a full spectrum economy of Ghana was sabotaged, but the principle remains. And Franklin Roosevelt had the same view when he was meeting with world leaders in 1944 in the Cairo Conference onward, preparing for the post-war age where it would be premised around certain common practices, as like, for example, in my second article on John Maynard Keynes, which I titled might be a little slanderous. Some people might think it's slanderous, but it's really not if you read the article. Fabian Society Eugenicist to World Government High Priest. A lot of quotes. Just read the article. It's on the CanadianPatriot.org. But I try to make the case that when you look at the Roosevelt grouping who wanted to export the New Deal, both in terms of banking reform as well as economic practice that was proven to be successful after 1933, and he wanted to internationalize this to give every nation the right to have access to these practices. It wasn't just American. And he was meeting with the Shah of Iran. He was meeting with leaders of South America, of Mexico, of Brazil, of China. And, you had people at the Bretton Woods conference from different delegations around the world. You had the Chinese delegation where it's incredible. I'm about to do an article on this too. It's just, it's amazing when you start digging into what was being fought over, because the Roosevelt groupings in Bretton Woods under Harry Dexter White and Morgenthau, who was a mixed bag, but Harry Dexter White was more anti-imperial and had a good sense of what this could be, what this anti-imperial win-win world of multipolarity could look like, which is what we were moving towards in 1945, in opposition to Churchill, in opposition to Keynes, who both represented a hard and soft British imperial sort of flavor, two flavors of the same poison. But they were meeting with the Chinese delegations who had signed on to a program for using America, using the early IMF, the World Bank, that were being created to become instruments for, it was kind of like, these were supposed to be kind of like international reconstruction finance corporations that would provide long-term, low-interest loans, kind of like what today China's doing with the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank or the China Export-Import Banks, but to provide those types of qualitative long-term loans for the development of the greening of the Sahara deserts, which Franklin Roosevelt is on record talking about, in Libya, in Morocco, and in Iran. He had projects also to help Iran, and the Shah loved these ideas of Iran. But so Harry Dexter White had met and endorsed programs for India, for South America, and from China, where Chiang Kai-shek, who was the head of the Kuomintang at the time, had signed on and endorsed these policies for the international development, big infrastructure programs of China that look a lot like what China actually ended up doing as of its 1997 and onward period, which were adopted and accepted by Mao and by Zhou Enlai. So all three, Deng Xiaoping, Mao, Zhou Enlai, Chiang Kai-shek, who we know their disputes caused the breakup and ultimately Taiwan versus mainland problem. But this was an idea that all sides endorsed. And you can only imagine, if this hadn't been sabotaged, what type of amazing world could have occurred where people realized, in spite of their ideologies, because obviously the Communist Party and Chiang Kai-shek had different ideologies for sure, but they had a common higher self-interest, which is not doctrinaire. It was based on national economics, national planning, and benefiting people both on all parts of, people basically were able to take from the pie, but the pie was induced to grow both in quantity and in quality under these types of infrastructure projects. So that was sabotaged when Roosevelt died in April 12th, 45. A lot of his enemies, unfortunately, who he had done battle with for the 13 years he was in power, increasingly permeated and took control of economic policy as well as foreign policy. And there was some rearguard action by people like Harry Dexter White, people like Henry Wallace, his former vice president, who was ousted for this Anglophile Truman, who really just loved Churchill. Like, it was crazy. But so there was some rearguard action, but increasingly we saw this real American system faction lose power in a very quick period of time, from really 1945 to 48, 49. People like Paul Robeson, who worked with Wallace on his presidential campaign in 48, were basically labeled commie traitors and blacklisted. Their careers were either destroyed. Some of them died prematurely, and that's another discussion maybe. But there's definitely a coup process, and Eisenhower had a little bit of, if you look at Eisenhower, he's a mixed bag. He was not a bad man. He was not part of the thing today people call deep state. He wasn't that. He didn't understand it either. He wasn't a politician. So there was a lot of influence of Roosevelt's enemies, like John Foster Dulles. J. Edgar Hoover inside of the U.S. was growing the FBI under this period of the 50s. And he warned, before, with his famous military-industrial complex speech after he met with Kennedy, and he really was warning the incoming administration and the people what it was that they had to be wary of that was causing them to lose their democracy completely. And JFK tried to push back against that. He tried to, and you could read his speeches where he talks about reviving Franklin Roosevelt's program. And in his own way, he does take it very far in the short period he's in office before that light is snuffed. But he does it in a brilliant way, bringing in the Roosevelt fight against Wall Street. He has a program to shut down. In JFK's case, maybe he moved too soon, too fast. Maybe he was a bit naive, trying to take on the Federal Reserve as fast as he did by issuing silver-backed treasury notes. Maybe that was too soon. I don't know. But he had a multi-level project, both to an internal draining of the swamp, but also an external program, like I mentioned, with Kwame Nkrumah or with Patrice Lumumba of Congo, and many other countries, to help them develop their own national power to stand on their own 2 feet, so that you could have fair trade with other partners of the world, rather than this monolithic, unipolar system from above nations telling people what they're allowed to do or not do, as unfortunately we see coming out of a lot of the networks today around the Great Reset agenda, which maybe that's not something you want to touch in this interview. But anyway, yeah.
It's a very interesting topic.
Yeah.
Something we have to address. Yeah. Well, that's really, you're a wealth of knowledge, and you've written a lot about what went wrong with the American system, or how it got corrupted, like also in the 19th century, not just World War II. Do you want to do it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm Canadian, and my book series on the Untold History of Canada was a really great exercise for me to that was my entry point in trying to sort of get a sense of what the hell is wrong with the world I've been born into. And I was told in going through the university system, through the high school system, that ultimately it's great that I'm not American. Thank God that we Canadians are not American, and we're just hammered and pummeled with this anti-American stuff from a very young age. And the theme tends to be, well, they were these selfish individualists who didn't want to have peace. They didn't want to pay their taxes to the overbearing but overall generous mother country, and they had their bloody rebellion, but we were smart and we stayed with the mother colony, and look, we've never had a revolution and we're free. Glazed over eyes, right? So one of the biggest interesting entry points when you start looking at the sort of history that we're not told, and this is interesting for Americans too, was a friend of mine who used to be a professor at Université de Montréal. He had written in 2007 a wonderful essay on Benjamin Franklin in Montreal. And that got my attention because I was never told that Benjamin Franklin was here for several months before in 1776. And when you actually look at what he was doing here with a small contingent of people from the Continental Congress, he was really working hard to organize, as part of his grand strategy, getting the Quebec colony that had recently become a part of the British Empire after the Plains of Abraham in the 7 Years' War. He wanted them to be the 14th member to sign on to the Declaration of Independence. And he likely should have, if you think about it, there was a lot of empathy from the Quebecois to the plight of the Americans, and you would think from popular opinion it should have happened. The problem I think he evaluated was the sophistication of British imperial grand strategy, and what he confronted was a very tightly controlled. Again, I like the term deep state. I just think it's given people an additional thought complex in their lexicon. But he encountered an organizational structure that had been put here by the British that made it impossible from the top to get any cooperation. So one of the problems was people were told, the farmers and the other potential participants were told, if you join the American Revolution, you'll be excommunicated and burn in hell forever. Unfortunately, from the standpoint of a peasant Quebecois who largely, illiteracy was much higher in Quebec than it was in the United States colonies. The colonies were known, unlike in Europe where they had a feudal system in Europe, your average person was not inclined to know how to read like the American Latin farmer was, who could read their own Bible, they could read the classics, and that allowed for a greater capacity to think about, well, what are philosophically the right ideas of natural law that I should give my life for. That was available in the U.S. cultural matrix, and in many ways that was because of Ben Franklin's work as a cultural warrior from 1720s onward with his Poor Richard's Almanac. And he did so many things on science as well to really enhance and amplify the spiritual, cultural level, so people could process those heavier ideas that they would need to if they were going to have the sort of revolution that he knew was possible, but it wasn't possible in 1720 or 30 or 40. So a lot of those problems of illiteracy were rampant. And so people were afraid, am I going to burn in hell forever for fighting with the Americans? And very few joined. There were some that did. And so this fellow I had read, this professor pulled together this story. I was like, well, wow, there's a whole other dimension to our history. And the reason I didn't mention this, the reason why they didn't join is that the British gave the French a certain bribery called the Quebec Act of 1774 that basically extended the Quebec possessions to surround all of the 13 colonies. It was very big. And that basically was, it was like a wall to prevent them across the Appalachian Mountains, to prevent any type of idea of a continental movement, which is what the whole Continental Congress was about. That's why it had the name. It was never going to be the revolution of the 13 colonies. And so the British were already thinking and preempting that, saying, okay, if you just stay loyal to us, we will allow you to have local political controls, local religious controls, but you have to stay loyal to the king. And unfortunately, most of them took that poison, and Benjamin Franklin sort of left empty-handed and did what he did. But if you look at Canadian history, it's been sort of a series of interesting, almost births, but that have been aborted by the failures of certain people who had potential, whether it was in the 1830s with certain rebellions that had happened that were premature and underthought through, or whether it was actual assassinations that had happened in the 1860s to 70s when we had allies of Abraham Lincoln in high positions of power in Canada, who at the end of the Civil War, after Lincoln had successfully kept the Union together despite the massive subversion from London, including the Montreal and Toronto Confederacy operations. Because this is a hotbed. If you look at, there's tons of books on this. Montreal and Toronto were that was the Confederacy Secret Service headquarters, where John Wilkes Booth even came from Montreal. He was up here for 6 weeks before he was deployed with a check from the governor of the Bank of Ontario, who became the mayor of Montreal in 1865. He was deployed. This check was found on his body when he was shot after killing Lincoln. So you had this whole complex in Canada that was running operations during the entire Civil War, both in terms of terrorist acts like the raid on Albany, but you also had economic warfare, short selling of the U.S. dollar, of the greenback from largely Montreal was a big zone of that, as well as, so Lincoln was dealing with the Southern Front. The Southern Front was getting their sponsorship as well as money and weapons from the British, things like the Alabama SS Alabama that destroyed something like 80 U.S. ships of the Union. This warship was made by Britain, and that's a different story. But all I'd say, so Canada played a very nefarious role, and a lot of the Lincoln allies, like Isaac Buchanan, was a big figure who was a big nation builder in Canada, who was fighting for developing canals, rail, modeling himself on Henry C. Carey. This faction was taken out towards the end of the Civil War and replaced with a very different pro-British, anti-Republican network that was put in solid power, where they created the Canadian Confederation. So we're told our confederation happened in 1867. The actual convention to create that confederation, the British North America Act, was in 1864. That was during the height of this. I mean, the Civil War was still happening. They were already pre-planning, how do we keep this possession, how do we keep it owned by the British mother colony? Because we need it in the Americas. It's the only monarchy of the Americas that gives us an ability to subvert the U.S. from territorially that zone. It's also a zone. If you look at the entire continental expanse of Canada, it has been a block between the natural organic alliance between Russia and the USA. You know, if you look at it, the Civil War, one of the big reasons, just like the French came in and saved the USA during the American Revolution, in many ways, Russia under Tsar Alexander II played a very similar role in sending the Russian fleet to the Atlantic and Pacific coasts in 1863 as a direct sign to the British imperial forces that if you go in and support openly the Southern Confederacy, that's a declaration of war on Russia. Russia was a deep ally, and they recognized that they had a common enemy in this thing centered in the city of London that had orchestrated the Crimean Wars that destroyed so much of Russia in the 1850s. That had initiated the Opium Wars to destroy China, that had initiated so much of the destruction of India, destroying India's ability to have its own textile industries through British free trade. And also that when India's textiles were destroyed, Britain, they were able to do what? Get India to produce opium instead of textiles, which then what did that do? Well, that went to China to feed them opium, to keep them submissive while they were being kept in a little box. So Canada was a geopolitical zone, and you could read the writings of people like Lord Alfred Milner from the Round Table Group, or Halford Mackinder, who worked together here in Canada in 1909, 1908. And you could read their writings where they're talking about the danger of a U.S., Russia, German under Otto von Bismarck type of alliance, which was pretty much dirigistic. It was based on extending the Lincoln Transcontinental Railway through British Columbia into Alaska, through Eurasia, which people were taught. I mean, there were people who were allies to Lincoln, like the first governor of Colorado, William Gilpin, who was openly organizing globally for this, what he called the Cosmopolitan Railway through the Bering Strait to happen. You could read his book, The Cosmopolitan Railway, published in 1890 on archive.org. Just Google archive.org, Cosmopolitan Railway. Google it, and you could read this thing. And the conception wasn't just this pretty idea. He was talking about funding it through an international system of Hamiltonian Henry Clay banking. He's talking about that. How do you invest $1 and get back 10 in return? 1890. He gets it. There's problems with it. And I mean, your readers can find problems with maybe some racist language that's not politically correct and problematic, but whatever. The point is, there was an understanding. This is a guy who was willing to give his life to stop slavery in the Civil War. That was William Gilpin. So he was working with people like Tsar Nicholas II, who funded teams of American engineers to come and do surveys of the Bering Strait Rail Tunnel in 1906 to do this. We had the Trans-Siberian Rail of Russia that was being built with, Philadelphia-made rail cars, and American teams of engineers associated with Henry C. Carey after the Centennial Exhibition of 1876. This was like the organic evolution, was a multipolar world of win-win cooperation with every nation accessing the right to utilize dirigistic American system-style banking. In Germany, it took the form of Frederick List and the American system of economy that List had developed with the Zollverein, the customs union. It took different flavors. It had different expressions based on the culture that it was in, whether it was in the Meiji Restoration period, or whether it was with, let's say, Sun Yat-sen, who in 1911, organized the Chinese Revolution, modeled on his studies of Lincoln and the American Revolution of Hamilton. That's what he did. He was a Christian Chinese leader, organized the overthrow of the dynastic systems in 1911, right? and created a Republic of China modeled on Lincoln's three principles of the people. And that is what was brought to Bretton Woods. So when the Chinese delegation came to Bretton Woods and they had their programs for the industrial development of China, it was entirely based on the 1920 International Development of China by Sun Yat-sen, which, again, archive.org, read it. It's right there. You just look at these beautiful maps that Sun Yat-sen, the first president of China, illustrated, and how it would be funded and how it was modeled on the best qualities of America. He was very self-conscious of this. And this is what they brought to Bretton Woods in 1944 as a program that Harry Dexter White and Roosevelt wanted to endorse in the post-war age. It's amazing to look at history this way, but it's so much more natural. There's so many fewer self-contradictions and paradoxes when you just look at it from the standpoint of the American system. Acknowledge that it exists, look at what it is, look at who's fighting for it, look at who's fighting against it. It's amazing how much coherence all of a sudden happens as far back as you want to look in history. It's so much more healthy.
Wow, what's amazing to me is your memory. I wish I could remember like that. That's great. A lot of stuff that we don't know about our own system. So after 1944, do you want to say a bit about what went wrong and how we've gotten sunk into this neoliberal,
Yeah, sure. I mean, people, I think if you want to really sink your teeth into it deeply, your readers can go to, or viewers can go to the Canadian Patriot, again, like I said, and part 2 and now part 3 are both published, so you can read them both. Part 2 takes on the Keynesian sleight of hand. So when Roosevelt died, like I said, the Keynesian faction ended up really taking over Canadian first. Because, I mean, a lot of these pro-Roosevelt factions in Canada that had nationalized the Bank of Canada in 1937, they died a series of very convenient deaths in 1940 and 41. That's something I'm sort of still working on, but there's a lot there to unpack. O.D. Skelton, the Justice Minister as well. The Governor General, Tweedsmeyer, was actually not that bad. Anyway, so you had a certain cleansing, a cleaning of house at the same time that certain groupings that were loyal to a British imperial ordering of world society, and the word British is loose here. I mean, they wanted a world that would be organized not by sovereign nation states, but rather by systems of supranational governance of experts from above, because the logic of these folks who are indoctrinated under a Rhodes Scholarship, or let's say a Fabian Society conditioning in the London School of Economics, you could be a good Rhodes Scholar. There's good people who are both, there's good people who go out of the London School of Economics. There's good people who come out of Oxford. Don't get me wrong. It doesn't make you bad. I'm not saying that.
Has a master's from London School of Economics.
Huh?
My daughter has
yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's not guilty by association. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that there's a certain type of recruitment policy within the elites who are sort of filtered through, and some of them are encouraged to be a part of a certain way of thinking. And I don't want to go into detail here, but all that to say, these groups, you can investigate how people like O.D. Skelton were keeping them at bay. O.D. Skelton was our foreign minister of Canada. And when he was ousted, when he was taken out, you had the takeover of our foreign ministry by a lot of Rhodes Scholars. Okay, I'm just saying that. In the U.S., Roosevelt talks to his son Elliot Roosevelt about the U.S. State Department being much more modeled on Churchill's way of doing things, and he talks about how he always has to fight against these forces within his own State Department, but he believes he could keep them at bay. He unfortunately doesn't live long enough to keep them at bay. And in the post-war era, the people allied to his vision of the beautiful world that should have been, that could be still, were ousted. And I mentioned the ousting of the slandering of Wallace and his fall in 1948. You had Dexter White, who died after being grilled by the McCarthyite, or before McCarthy, you had the House on Un-American Activities that was treating all of these guys like they were just Soviet agents because they wanted U.S., Russia, China cooperation. They didn't want a Cold War of nuclear annihilation. You had many others as well. Sumner Welles was another one who was slandered and ousted, the Undersecretary of State. So what happened from 1946 to 1971 was a system where, okay, Keynesian and top-down planning happened, but there wasn't a lot of the actual political economic vision involved in it. JFK tried to channel it towards doing big projects, space, water projects in America, beyond. Those were all good, but overall it was more about just constricting and controlling the levers in a very administrative way from a top-down central banking planning structure. It wasn't really very visionary. It wasn't very American system in that sense. And increasingly, the Bretton Woods system was made weaker and weaker as the U.S. went into more of a consumer modality of behavior. And one of the weakest points of the Bretton Woods was I think it was like $33 or something like that per ounce of gold, which was the frozen price value from 1932 of like the price of gold on the market. So they kept that fixed so that while the price of gold was increasing in Europe, in the markets, it was staying fixed at $32, this obsolete sum in the US case. And, there were certain political manipulations played. I have to get into them a little bit more to fully talk about them thoroughly, but this was used to create certain bubbles of speculation that were able to undermine the US dollar. A certain set of crises were induced partially due to the loss of investment in long-term infrastructure projects that was being absorbed by the Vietnam War. And, a certain crisis was created whereby in 1971, the dollar was removed as a solution to the crisis from the fixed exchange rate system. And all of a sudden, it was floated onto the world market. So all of a sudden it was the random will of the animal spirits of the markets that became the determinant of what would be the value of a dollar or anything. Parity pricing was eliminated, with that as well. Like the idea of allowing only a certain rational fluctuation of the price of a good to only occur within limits so that it could never be so expensive, right? That for people who don't know what parity planning was, this is what we did throughout much of the Bretton Woods period was, if a good couldn't ever go so high that people on the markets couldn't afford to buy it, but it could never go so low, deflationarily speaking, that the producers of the good couldn't afford to sustain their overhead cost of production. Otherwise they go bankrupt. That was the Great Depression. That's why Roosevelt had to lower the cost of the value of the, anyway. So that was all eliminated. And we had this sort of new age of increasingly Austrian School, the Polarization Society, the Austrian School thinking of neoliberalism became more and more hegemonic, with people like Pinochet being instituted as a certain prototype for what the West was going to have to do soon under a certain Western-sponsored coup d'etat in Chile. And, people are wondering like, well, but no, Pinochet was a dictator. Why are you saying free market? Well, if you look at it, he was put there by higher forces who wanted him to do what he did, which was liberalize the markets, privatize a whole bunch of state-run enterprises, cut social spending on all sorts of things that the former government of Allende had done. And then this was increasingly brought online in the late 70s under Reaganomics and Thatcherism, which resulted in the Big Bang. Just deregulate everything, just let it go, let pirates have social Darwinism to the nth degree, and let the strong beat out the poor in this race for diminishing returns, and it was free for all. So that was the party that's now coming to an end.
Oh, that's really interesting. So how would you? I don't know. Might be going far afield, but I've struggled with this. How do we do a reserve currency, or how do we keep currencies from being short sold and exploited? And, how do we value national currencies globally so that we have a functional system that's fair to all?
Well, I think your writings have been really wonderful in that direction. I think anybody who really wants to think about serious problem solving instead of endless bickering about bottom up versus top down or whatever should really, take some of the work that you've been producing over these years seriously, because I think that, it's in every nation. If you're a sovereign nation, it's your sovereign right to have a national bank. You don't have to have private supranational financiers telling your government what's allowed to do or not do, economically speaking. And it doesn't mean you have to be a dictatorship. It doesn't mean that free markets or private enterprise has to be quashed. In fact, looking at history, every time this was done with the correct way of thinking and heart in mind, it always resulted in the enhancement of private sector growth and real development. And I think that today, I mean, people have to accept this scary truth that I think that our intellects sometimes create a firewall from thinking about because it's scary. Maybe we feel disempowered, but the financial system as we are living under it in the transatlantic is a bubble that's going to blow. I mean, it's a scientifically verifiable. It's not my opinion. You could look at what's underpinning and holding this. Again, I think I said at the beginning of our discussion, I mean, conservative estimates have this at anywhere between 780 trillion to 1.5 quadrillion dollars of derivatives assets, you know, like these speculative claims on securitized debts that are gambled upon and insured upon and then sub-gambled upon, and it's infinitely divisible, and it's a chimera. It's in many ways parallel to what we saw the world or Germany go through in Weimar in 1922 to 23. It's similar, but it's worse because it's more global and bigger, because we have things like high frequency trading, and we have all sorts of computerized gobbledygook that's like created, you know, much greater exponential numbers, but it's overall the same underlying process. And just like it would have been the same solution if you look at what was not done, because in Germany in 1923, 22 to 23, there were sort of two approaches to Europe that were being imposed to deal with the unpayable Versailles Treaty debts put onto the people who lost the war, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, which was on the one hand what we had in Austria from 1919 to 1921, which was under the direction of the Bank of England's Montague Norman and his assets, Ludwig von Mises and his assistant Friedrich von Hayek, who were the chief economic advisors to the Austrian government. They did one bottom-up solution, which was fascist economics that killed a lot of people. It was cold-hearted. And then you had another solution, which was more top-down in Weimar Germany, which was print infinite money to just pay the debts, whatever the cost, bail out the banks. But in both cases, they resulted in mass death, psycho-spiritual destruction of the people. Neither one was good. And in the case of Weimar Germany, the crisis of hyperinflation, where, you know, like everyone became a trillionaire. I still have my grandmother from Germany. She gave me her $50 billion mark or 50 billion Reichsmark note. It was toilet paper. But the point was to always drive to do a shock therapy on the people, just like it was in Austria under a different poison, and induce them to accept terms of economic behavior and politics that they would never have accepted democratically otherwise. And that's what Hjalmar Schacht, who was again a Montague Norman asset, who was brought in to solve the problem of hyperinflation in Germany by saying, okay, let's have a great reset. You could bring in your wheelbarrows of useless, worthless toilet paper notes, and we'll give you these new Rentenmarks. But the problem is these new Rentenmarks are going to have a new set of rules associated with them. And these new rules are going to be, well, austerity. You're going to have to take cuts in all sorts of jobs were slashed. Things were, social safety nets were removed. Basically, it was, in many ways, what the Austrian School is already doing in Austria. And the Austrian School is celebrated for saying, well, Ludwig von Mises and von Hayek stopped hyperinflation in Austria. Yeah, but they did it by how? They just cut services to everything, like we've been telling Greece to do, you know? Privatize your everything and cut services to pay your IMF debts and be good that way. And so it was always a fraud. And the solution back then was Walter, hold on, what's his name? There was an assassinated foreign minister who organized the Rapallo Treaty in 1922. God, read my article, part 2. But the point is, the foreign minister of Germany, who was assassinated by an anarchist group that was associated with British intelligence, had a program to work with Warren Harding in the United States, as well as especially with Russia, in creating the Rapallo Accords in Italy that would have basically negated, would have forgiven all Versailles Treaty debts and would have taken the credit of Germany and reorganized it to be invested into New Deal type projects, because these guys were all part of the Frederick List Society. Frederick List was the American system representative of Germany, who created a whole movement under Otto von Bismarck after he died. But they were all trying to bring back this American system policy of saying, okay, let's reorganize our credit, let's reorganize our debt, largely the way Hamilton did after the bankruptcy of America after 1776. He had to reorganize the debt and turn it into, instead of this unpayable, useless, passive debt, an active form of credit for the investments into a new system of rail, of water, of ports, of things like that. And Walter, God, it's going to come to me. Anyway, I'm sorry, I just forgot his name. So he was assassinated, and that was the solution. That would have stopped Hitler from happening. Today, it's sort of similar. You have to look at the fact that the banks are going to collapse. The banking system is going to default. The value is not going to be worth much of anything. And the only thing that will have value is what sustains your life. That has real value. So you need things like what Roosevelt did, number one, in his first 100 days. You got to use that as a serious role model. So things like Glass-Steagall, you got to get a serious, and I know you've endorsed this for years, get Glass-Steagall in, break up the speculators and let them take their own losses, stop bailing them out, but protect the commercial banks and use that protection to reorganize the payable from unpayable debts the way Roosevelt did with his bank holiday, right? You got to let some banks collapse. It's a fact. But the banks that are going to be solvent are going to be reorganized under a federal mandate to reinvest the way you documented in your new article, through some form of national banking practice, whether it's a form of Reconstruction Finance Corporation of the 21st century or whatever. You got to get national credit into investments into infrastructure. You got to get people loans. You got to support people from their foreclosures. Farms are going to foreclose. We're already at a high point of farm foreclosures that's causing a very great danger of a massive food crisis that's already bad. It's not going to be a gradual, slow, things are just going to kind of just gradually get worse. There is a breaking point that's going to hit like a shock. And so people have to think, okay, who's going to take the brunt of that shock? Who's going to take the pain? Is it going to be the people? Because that's what the Great Reset crowd wants. They want to put the pain on the people, and they're willing to take financial losses by like 95%. They're willing to do that as long as their political power is going to increase over the people. And thank God for China and Russia, because honestly, were it not for the multipolar alliance that's created this alternative economic system in the East, that's an open system offering olive branches after olive branches for us to join and work with in harmony. If that wasn't there, I'd be a lot more depressed. And I'm still not happy, but I'd be a lot more depressed. So there is a way of just simply looking at the fact that, okay, these countries are doing the things that we used to do successfully, and now they're the only ones doing it. And they're offering us chances to work with them. And I think that those chances are not going to be taken away by their will. But I think that there's a lot of bad thinking that's very hegemonic amongst Western governments, and the people have to become more courageous and strong-minded about their history and how they're being manipulated into these false polarizations. To think that, whether if you're on the left, you tend to think, okay, well, the media I watch told me that Russia is the big enemy of the world. That's what they did to put their puppet in power in 2016. Now I know that Russia is the global villain. And, that's one fallacy. That's not true. And other people on the right who are more conservative minded are of the view, oh no, it's China. China is the ultimate global supervillain and natural enemy of America. That's who we should be fighting. It's like, whoa, you guys are both being hoodwinked. Like, look at your history. Look at who's controlling the levers of the society right now that you're living under. It's not China or Russia. That's your solution. Right? That's the water to put out the fire. It's there. And you're being told that water is scary and evil. Your house is on fire. So it's like, I think that it's better to look at it that way.
Yeah. We have to figure out some way to all come together. My feeling clearly it's been the art of war for centuries that you divide people and pit them against each other, because whoever they are, the deep state or the World Economic Forum or the overlords or the big corporatists or whoever they are, we way outnumber them. If we could get together, we win. It's obvious we win with a truly democratic system.
Yeah.
Before they manage to get a control system in that we can't break out of. But working out the details is very tricky. My sense about it seems to me that we should have if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and you've got food and shelter and all that as the bottom rung, that should be covered by the government, I would say. That should be your safety net. You can't fall below that. You're not going to be literally out in the street, or pay enough to cover that. And then beyond that, people say, well, if you had a universal basic income, then people wouldn't work, or it'll come with strings attached, and then you'll have totalitarian rule from the top, and we don't want either of those. But it seems to me, that's not going to be enough money to really do anything interesting. I mean, people want more money than that, so they will definitely get out there and build their own business or whatever, get a job, and they want a nice house. They want to travel and all those other things that aren't going to be covered with a modest universal basic income. But that we have some sort of safety net, it does seem like that should be. I always think of the human body as the ideal model. And so we get all these cells to work together. But I suppose if you use that for a model, it would be from each according to his.
No, you imagine, right? Like if the cells of the body operated the way a top-down Keynesian or a bottom-up Austrian School thinker would presume, I mean, the body would in various ways be at war with itself or be a tyrant to itself. There's no, nature is different, and I love that. Right now, we've been feeding the cancer with bailouts. We've been feeding culturally the worst elements of our thinking, of our presumption, like our prejudices. This has been consciously politically fed to grow this cancer at the expense of the healthy tissue of the body of humanity for a very long time. And at a certain point, we have to decide, like, let's maybe stop doing that. Let's empower our white blood cells. let's do some surgery here and rehabilitate. So your metaphor of the human body and economy is, I think, really it's good.
My daughter's heavily into biomimicry, and so I was asking her for a model, a good model. And the more I thought about it, I thought the human body is actually the best model for working together. Well, I won't go too far into that, but so we probably should wrap up. So it's just been great talking to you, Matthew. You're a fund of knowledge, and it's interesting to me that you know so much about our system, the American system. And so that's great.
It was super nice to be on, and thank you for having me as a guest.
Yeah, I hope we'll keep up the connection.
Yeah, me too.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.